Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Max Isaac, Member Services Manager at the Charles River Regional Chamber. And today's webinar is What Does the Outside World Have to Do with My DEI Strategy? Presented by Greg Almieda. He is a DEI advisor, but he is also the CEO and the founder of Global View Communications. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to our DEI initiative sponsors, Direct Federal Credit Union, In-Source Services, UMass Amherst Mount Ida Campus, NBCU Boston, and William James College for making this possible. Okay, we're going to stop sharing the screen. And Greg, thank you for being here. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Happy Tuesday. Greg Almieda. I am the founder and CEO of GVC. We are let me share my screen. I'm sorry. We are an inclusion business strategy firm that is based in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, but we do work all over the country. And anytime I get a chance to be associated with the town of Needham, I like to tell people that are from the town of Needham or surrounding area that I actually went to Pollard Junior High in Needham many, many years ago, for those of you that are familiar with that middle school. As I mentioned, GVC has been around since 2000. We're really focused on sort of 5 solutions for our partners: inclusion business strategy, inclusion immersion activities, recruiting solutions, workforce research solutions, and policy reviews. As a organization, we're organized around 3 practice areas: the GVC brand, the Fluency brand, and the Insight Squad brand, which does workforce research solutions, as I just mentioned. But we're here today to talk about what the outside world has to do with our DE&I strategy. We are going to leave some time towards the end for us to have a conversation or to answer any questions that you may have. But we're really set up today to do 3 things. One is to sort of navigate the current environment around DE&I and trying to look a little bit out into the future. The second part of this is to try to anticipate what may be coming, which in some cases changes from day to day and moment to moment. But the other part of it is, why does the outside world matter and how to prepare for it? One thing I just want to say is that in terms of the title, what the outside world has to do with my DE&I strategy, in some ways, this is nothing new. We went through this many times over the last few years where the outside world played a outsized impact on what organizations did and did not do, what they committed to as far as diversity is concerned, or social justice. And I don't think we need to look any further than after May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, to see the trajectory or the commitments that organizations made, both because of what was going on in society, but also because what employees and other stakeholders kind of demanded that they do, or practices that they address a change. One question that I get a lot, especially over the last 7 or 8 months, is how are we doing? How is GVC doing in this environment? Thank God we've still got some breath and some life. But one of the things that I thought about was, what kind of an analogy could I use to sort of describe how we're doing? What you're looking at here is a rain delay and at a baseball game. And that was sort of the original description that I would have used to describe how we were doing. But after I thought about it, 2 things sort of jumped out at me. One is nobody's on the field. And the second is that the stands are kind of empty. And after thinking about it further, I thought that this was a more apt description on how we're doing. And the conditions are bad. The conditions are actually terrible, but we're still on the field. So that's the way I answer the question now when people ask how we're doing in this space. I say to them, conditions are bad, but we are still on the field. So when we think about DE&I, we have to think about sort of how this has evolved over the last 50 or 60 years. We have been doing diversity in this country for about 60 years now, coming out of the civil rights movement and the various iterations and versions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at the beginning of this conversation in the 60s, when all of these programs started to come to fore and corporate American corporations and institutions started to be more engaged with the communities around them and the communities that they wanted to be engaged with, it was more or less of a moral case that sort of drove the initiatives or the activities. We moved pretty quickly to 2000. In 2000, the year 2000 is really a seminal point as it relates from flipping to the moral case to the business case, because some of you may remember that in 2000, when the census came out in 2000, it shocked everyone in terms of how much the country had changed demographically and ethnically. And the predictions going into 2030 and 2050 is that the country was going to change even more. And so it set up a different set of activities around the business case for DE&I in terms of representation, what kind of plans one was going to have or an organization was going to have to engage in these markets. We expanded the definition a bit. It went beyond race and ethnicity to and gender to different aspects of diversity or different dimensions of diversity. And then one of the things that started to happen, especially around the Latino market after the 2000 census was released, was there were a lot more multicultural marketing efforts because what companies saw was a lot of financial value in these markets that may not have been realized or even acknowledged prior to that. Where we find ourselves now is in a political case around DEI, whether that's capital P, politics, R, Republican, D, Democrat, I, Independent, or a lowercase political case definition, which is really about sort of society, right? So right now, what we're facing is a lot of government intervention. We had government intervention in the 60s in the form of laws to sort of push affirmative action and other aspects of DEI at that time. But now we have government interaction that's saying put on the brakes, stop, etc. There is a big conversation about what's called a zero-sum game. You win, I lose. And that is at the basis of a lot of the friction around DE&I now. There's a perception that resources in this country are declining, which really drives the us versus them mentality. And then the piece around whose culture dominates. And when we talk about culture, we're talking about the things that people experience sort of in their daily lives and how they live their lives, whether it's what you read, what you listen to, the dominant culture in terms of popular culture. We're really in a discussion now about how those things are sort of really rubbing up against each other, and there doesn't seem to be any real unification as there was in the past. So part of what comes out of this conversation or this us versus them mentality is this idea sort of around competing forces, right? DEI is under attack, and this is the first time that we actually have names and faces to put to those opposing viewpoints. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you see some of the people who have been very vocal about the fact that DEI is not a positive for the country. And some people are using words like illegal. Some people are using words like immoral around DE&I. As a matter of fact, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see Robbie Starbuck, who was actually initiated a lot of the pushback in corporate America around DEI, um, Tractor Supply and others. We'll talk about that in just a second. But we do have some countering forces around sort of this pushback. And we know, based on experience and years' experience and just the evidence, that DE&I is actually good for corporate America and it's actually good for society. So although the loudest voices in the room right now are have a lot to say about it and are competing for space and competing for time and really trying to drive the conversation, we do have a counter argument. One could make the case that this is a long time coming, but one of the things that we wanted to do today was just sort of narrow the timeline a little bit. And if we go back to June in June 2023, we saw that the Supreme Court struck down admissions programs at a couple of universities. The other thing the Supreme Court did back in June or July is they said it was okay to discriminate. Retailers could discriminate based on their religious belief against gay couples. That decision didn't get as much play as the admissions program decision. But what began to happen was this fear just sort of permeated corporate America from a decision about admissions to a decision of or a perception that some of the work and some of the commitments that we made about DE&I were actually illegal. And then we started to hear that word attached to DE&I more and more. Shortly thereafter, we started to see a lot of walkbacks from very, very major corporations. But as of now, only about 10 or 15% of the Fortune 500 have actually made public statements. And here we go with the public statements again, because we had public statements about commitment to DE&I and social justice and equity and other issues in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd. And we have public statements now about shifts and changes and just complete abandonment around DE&I. But the fact of the matter is, only about 10 to 15% of companies in the Fortune 500 have actually walked back their DE&I commitments. But that doesn't change the perception, because the narrative right now is what is actually driving the fear. This continued, these continued pronouncements, these continued communications and articles that come out that talk about how companies, the government, and other institutions are pulling back from DE&I. And so it's set up a climate of fear that has frozen a lot of people or a lot of organizations in place. And the challenge right now is to get that iceberg to melt a bit. Because as we see, DE&I is actually not illegal. The other piece around this too that I just want to bring up is we've got a little bit of a patchwork system in the United States now around uh, where DE&I is really under attack versus where it is supported. In Massachusetts, Governor, Attorney General has already come out and said DEI is not illegal. No one's going to be sued for DE&I. We encourage you to continue your commitments. Missouri, a few months ago, actually sued Starbucks because what they said was Starbucks didn't have enough white males working in their stores. So it really depends on where you are in the country that will determine whether or not you're in a zone of what I'm going to call support and a zone of safety. One middle ground that a lot of organizations have decided to do or to find is to change the name of the work from DEI to various other ways to refer to it. Everyone has to make this decision for themselves. This is just a small example of some major organizations and institutions who have determined that they're better off changing the name of the work. Some have changed the initiatives, some have not. It really is an individual decision, but again, this is to just give you a sense of how companies are referring to the work now, and how they are talking about or communicating their commitment. But just know that we've lost some stuff along the way. BlackRock came out a few years ago with Bank of America and basically talked about rethinking the purpose of corporate America, and whether or not the focus on making money is the sole reason for being. And part of what they both said a few years ago was that the social good should be part of that conversation or the reason for being. But what we found over the last 4 or 5 years, especially, is a big shift. And again, this is just one example, BlackRock being the largest asset manager in the world. And Larry Fink, the CEO, deals with all of the Fortune 500 and global CEOs. And so he's very, very well respected. But they've even had to move back from their full commitment to DE&I and social and racial justice. The other example that I wanted to show you was Dove. Some of you may remember a few years ago that Dove decided to build their brand around body positivity, which meant that the way that their marketing and product design manifested itself was really around inclusion and diversity. They got a lot of applause and recognition for doing it. It seemed to work really well. It enhanced their bottom line. But most recently, they've decided to backtrack against body positivity and begin to use AI models. There's a whole conversation about that we can have some other time. But really, what I wanted to show you is how the two sort of extreme ends, one in sort of the financial services part of our economy, as well as the retail or consumer products part of our economy, how these changes are beginning to sort of manifest themselves on a daily basis. And it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. One of the concerns that a lot of folks have is in terms of hiring and how that's going to be impacted with some of these rules, not necessarily rules, but guidelines or left and right hand margins that have sort of been set up. Um, Harvard is being investigated for their hiring practices and amongst other things. And there's a concern that whatever comes out of that, if things are found not to be in their favor in terms of the way that they're doing things, that there could be a chilling effect around how we hire people and the way that we do our outreach and the way that we do our development to ensure representation, and to ensure, quite frankly, that we get the best and the brightest talent. Which brings up the question, what's under scrutiny? And again, one's commitment to any one of these initiatives is purely a decision that is tailored towards your organization. Can an outside force that doesn't have standing, or even an inside force that doesn't have standing, pick one of these and say that you're discriminating against a group of your employees because you have these programs in place or these initiatives in place? Absolutely. But after in between June of 2023 and the Supreme Court decision, and then the pronouncements and announcements of corporate America moving back, one of the things that we saw in a lot of the press accounts is that corporations were saying, we're not going to do this or that any longer, whether it's a diverse interview slate, whether it's executive search criteria, whether it's targeted recruiting. One of the things that we began to saw is not just sort of general walkbacks on the idea of DE&I, but we started to see specific retrenchment on different types of initiatives. So what we wanted to do here is to just sort of give you a sense of some of the specific initiatives that have come under attack. So let's talk about what I had mentioned earlier, and that is how can we sort of prepare for this? I think that in my work and in my experience, one of the first things that we have to do is to determine the stakeholders. These are not in any particular priority order, and quite frankly, the stakeholder community that surrounds your particular business, your particular organization, could be slightly different than someone else on the call or even my stakeholder group. But typically, these are the five stakeholder groups that we should be concerned about and keep our eye on. Obviously, the first is employees. The second is customers, the community in which your business is, the community in which you hire from. I'm sorry, is located, the business where your business is located. If you're publicly traded, shareholders. If you're not publicly traded, owners, whether it's family or others, and then sort of the broader society from which you impact. And a lot of it is really answering the question around what and how, right? So in the employees category, what benefits our employees overall and supports their well-being? How do our customers benefit? What value and value exchange do we bring to our customers? How does the community benefit from us? What do we support? What causes do we support? What causes do we sort of advocate for? What do we sponsor? Um, and how it's a fundamental issue with shareholders and owners. It's like, what benefits the bottom line, or how does this work, or how does the bottom line get benefited through some of this work? And what we do, how does it support sort of the broader society that we're a part of? So we're going to talk about two tools here. One is a strategic tool and the other is an analysis tool. There is some analysis as part of this strategy, building a strategy. By the way, building a strategy is not for everyone. You don't have to have over 100 employees to build a strategy. The application or the ability to build a strategy reads down to a company like mine with 5 employees, but it is a process and it is time consuming. And there's really sort of 5 pieces to this, or 5 categories of this that I'd like to just sort of run through very quickly. We can talk about it on the other side. So the first one is, what's your end game? What is it that you're trying to accomplish with this work? And what does success look like? But I think that having a clear idea of what you're trying to accomplish is going to set the tone for the rest of the work. Because one of the things that you may find out is after you've defined the end game or thought about what the end game should or could be, when you go through this process, that end game may evolve or it may change. But having some idea of what you're trying to accomplish is really, really important. The second part is really sort of like understanding the current state and the environment that you're operating in. So if we think about the prior slides that we went through, which really show that DE&I is under assault and is under threat, then if we take that as all that is happening in the marketplace, then we are going to have sort of a different outcome at the end. I think personally, the way that I describe it is that it is under threat and changing, meaning that I'm seeing signs that the frozen middle, the folks who want to do stuff, are beginning to move towards action, but it's very slow and it's very methodical. So the current state that I see as an advisor and a consultant that works with many different companies could be very different than the current state that you see in your particular industry or your particular geography. But you do want to identify the stakeholders and do a little bit of a stakeholder analysis. How mature is the work, right? Have you done things before that have fallen into the category of activities and haven't really been centered or attached to anything in the organization, like driving revenue or enhancing brand and that sort of stuff. We just talked a little bit about external factors, competitors, and capital P politics. Again, RDI, Republican, Democrat, Independent. That's what I mean when I say capital P politics. And then begin to sort of collect some data, collect some information. You can do that through surveys. You can do that through talking to people inside your organization and outside your organization. We're going to talk about the external conversations in just a minute. Then comes time to sort of form an action plan. So what's your mission, right? Again, tied to what's your end game. What is it that we're really trying to accomplish? What are our priorities? What are the two, three, or four things that we can activate and act on well, as opposed to 10 or 15 things that we won't do as well? So what are our priorities? How are we going to know that we've been successful in terms of key performance indicators? What do you need in terms of resources? Typically, resources are defined as people, power, and money. Do you need either? Who in your organization is going to ultimately be responsible for this? Will they be doing it as part of another job, or will they be focused on this only or solely? What are our engagement strategies? Are we going to focus on building relationships with organizations? Are we going to be focused on building relationships with individuals? What causes are we going to align ourselves with, et cetera? Then, it's time to implement the plan. Again, there's the resources that you need. Who's going to be the directly responsible individual for this work? What are our limitations? Because, we have day jobs and the business has a core purpose or core reason for being. So, how are we going to do this with the same level of effort as we do other things that we do really well in the organization? And how are we going to communicate this both internally and externally? Typically, the external communication around this is what appears sort of on your website, and what people can kind of glean from your activities, where you are, who you're associated with, what organizations are you associated with. And then once you've implemented over a period of time, 6 months, it may be time to sort of monitor and adjust. Are we meeting the goals that we set out? There are a couple of different goal categories. There are activity goal categories, and then there's outcome goal categories. And again, you will have decided that a little bit earlier in the plan. And basically, the definition of each one is pretty easy. The activity is how much activity did we engage in over a period of time? Was it the right activity? The outcomes are if we decided that we wanted to increase, decrease, enhance a particular thing in our organization, whether it be brand, how we spend our money, how we save money, then you will want to take a look at that as well in terms of meeting your goals. And then once you've done that, what's working and what's not? Again, you may be 9 months to a year out before you answer that question. So that's why it's called monitor and adjust. But the reality is, at some point, if things are not working the way that you want them to work, in terms of your strategy, you might want to think about maybe making some changes. Again, for me, the big thing is on the front end, and that's defining what your end game is. So let's talk a little bit of about a PESTEL analysis. PESTEL has been around a long time. Those of us that have been to business school are familiar with this tool. It's really an external facing tool that gives you a sense or that should quantify or validate what's happening in the external community. There are 6 aspects to it: the political aspect, the economic aspect, the social aspect, the technological aspect, environmental aspect, and the legal aspect. Under each one of these, I just gave a few examples. So under the political, what are the government policies or not, and laws and what and bureaucracy. Under economic, do we have inflation considerations? Do we have employment considerations? Do we have consumer considerations in terms of looking at what we can and can't do externally? And this is a process. So what you're looking at here just sort of describes the PESTEL analysis. There is a specific process one would use to do a PESTEL analysis. You can be super sophisticated with it and take in a whole bunch of information, or you can rely on your own perceptions and your own experiences in your industry and your geography and the people that you're talking to run a PESTEL analysis that will be in a good range of accuracy. But at the end of the day, there is a actual process to do this. It's kind of lengthy, so all I'm giving you today is just sort of the overview of it. What are the changes in technology? I know that right now, for a lot of us, including GVC, AI is huge. How we're adopting AI to not only help us with our work, but also provide an additional resource. Everybody is adopting AI differently. The tool is the tool, but how people are using it is very different depending on your organization and what you're looking for, whether it's research, whether it's an additional resource to actually get work done. Environmental, you know, sustainability is a huge thing. Anybody that works with Gen Z knows that the environmental piece is huge, huge, huge. Like, what is our impact on the environment? How they view the future in terms of the environment. And then the legal piece, employment law, safety standards, data protection, et cetera, with all the breaches and stuff that are going on. So again, this is an analysis tool that helps you take a look at the external environment. Strategy helps you take a look at the external environment and the internal environment as well. So that's the fundamental difference. A strategic assessment done properly should have an external component to it. Not all strategy has an external component to it, but if done right, it should have some external component to it, even if that's talking to your customers or people that interact with your organization on a regular basis. So as we come towards the end of our discussion and the finish line, I'm going to give you a couple of action steps here. So what I did was I broke this down into small enterprise and larger enterprises because I realized that there are a fair number of people that are part of this chamber that fall into the small business category and middle market category. And the tools, what you want to accomplish is the same, but the tools and the time to do it may be slightly different. So in terms of looking at, your position in the community and in the market, just take a look at how your workplace and your brand are perceived with those stakeholder groups. If you're a larger enterprise, you'll probably have the ability, the resources, the time, or a partner who can conduct some feedback sessions with your stakeholders to see how DEI is impacting your organization and versus your competitors. Do some external benchmarking, obviously. I am a big proponent of having a cycle of doing these assessments or these scans. You should be looking at every couple, 3 years. I know a lot of organizations do employee engagement surveys. You should continue to do that. But you may want to think about how you're gathering the information around DEI or inclusion or whatever, however you're referring to it, because um, that in and of itself is a category that can have a huge impact on your business. And then annually, you want to use, the right metrics and the right measures to look at DEI specifically and potentially measure it against your peer group. Again, employee experience, we just talked about that, employee engagement, employee experience. Biannual surveys is one way to do it. If you're a small enterprise, you can even talk to people, focus groups, a small enterprise. You can use a more sophisticated method, more sophisticated analytical method. If you're a larger enterprise, and you can look at things like location, demographics, et cetera. You can cut up the data and get more detailed or information or more insightful information. And policy reviews are really, really important. I think we had a spate of policy reviews after the administration came out and said that DEI was illegal, and these are the things that fall into the illegal category. Most of that, or some of that, is fear. Some of that stuff is not illegal. It has already been tested. Good employment lawyer would be able to tell you that better than I would. I'm not an employment lawyer. Taking a look at your policies and your practices are important as well. So what do you do if you're a smaller business? Um, some of you may have seen the diversity wheel, which has different dimensions of diversity in terms of how people sort of identify themselves or what's identifiable about them. Not all diversity programs need to be focused on race and ethnicity and gender. There are other ways that you can do this. If you're a smaller business, there's some opportunities that I think that you should take a look at as it relates to inclusion or DE&I. One is community giving, clearly internship programs, non-race-based affinity groups, family groups, caregiver groups, etc., are two categories of non-race-based affinity groups. Maybe you have like a council that is multiracial, multi-generational, etc. Volunteer days, that's huge. A lot of smaller businesses do that, but maybe not as consistently based on the opportunities that they have to volunteer in their various locations. Volunteer days are good. Company outings at minority-owned businesses, making sure that maybe you're buying, if you're having a lunch inside your organization or some sort of an event, maybe buying from a diverse business in your community. And then obviously awareness opportunities are huge, visiting museums, etc. Is a good way to fulfill some of these inclusion desires that the company may have. So we're at the end of our the presentation part of our conversation. If you'd like to get our newsletter Beyond the Backlash, just shoot me an email. If you'd like to get a copy of this presentation, feel free to send me an email and I will send it over to you. But again, greg@globalviewcom.com if you want to get on our newsletter Beyond the Backlash, and if you want a copy of the presentation, greg@globalviewcom.com. So let's engage in a discussion.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any questions you want.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentation. Wilmore Whitley from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I felt like a lot of this was specific to businesses. That's totally fine, but I see parallel in higher ed. I think for us, it's more complicated. more complex because there are more levers that can be used to put pressure
Mhm.
on an academic institution,
Mhm.
the threat of, federal funding and all of that. But what I've seen now more commonly are employees, faculty, staff who are engaged in DEI work, uh, who are more scared now for their names to be associated with those
Mhm.
titles. Fear of not being funded for research grants that they're writing up for, but also for people who are immigrants who are fearful that maybe their immigration status will be challenged if they're seen associated with any sort of work that can be categorized as DEI. And so I know that we've said, the laws haven't changed and all that. What advice do you have for employers as we navigate kind of this, landscape with employees who have those fears? And I would say those fears are not unfounded because they've seen people targeted.
So the your observation about the presentation being business focused is absolutely correct. That's the experience that we have. We're not experts in higher education, and so that's the reason why the presentation was designed that way. Look, I think that in terms of people feeling like they can speak out, it's all about how safe you feel in your organization and who makes you feel safe in the organization. That's the leadership. If you post something. And we're seeing it right now with people that have posted things, appropriate or not, about Charlie Kirk and how people are getting fired for making those statements. It's really all about whether the leadership team or the CEO is tolerant enough to allow people to sort of speak their minds on any particular issue. So I wish there was this sort of like blanket a kind of answer to your question. If you work in an environment where, if one works in an environment where one may be afraid to sort of speak out on this issue, um, that's factual, right? There's a reason that you feel that way. And whether or not you'll be able to bring it up in a meeting or have a one-on-one conversation with the CEO or the person that you report to, that's really dependent on the organization. Should you be able to? 100%, but should you and can you are two different things.
I know, Greg, you mentioned a lot of information, but if people had to walk away with one thing, what would you say is the most important thing to walk away?
Be aware of what's happening externally and try to stay as close to current events as you can. There are organizations, although they're not getting as much press and as many headlines as those that are backtracking. There are organizations out there that are moving forward with the commitments that they made. I feel like the iceberg is beginning to melt, although it's going to be very slow. It's going to be a very, very slow process. But just stay aware of current events.
I go? Yeah, all right. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative. And I did get a sense from your presentation that we're in that storm right now. But are there certain events that, as we look forward over the next couple of years, that will start to have this situation sort of in retreat? Are there some guideposts that you could cite that might be indicative of we're moving away from this current state that we're in?
Yeah. So the way that I would answer that question is, how sick are people being told what to do about this issue? And I think that there's a groundswell. I don't think it's so some of these answers are not as sophisticated as the question, right? Because you asked a really sophisticated question like guidepost. And basically what I'm seeing in the conversations that I'm having is that people have come to the conclusion some have come to the conclusion that nothing can really happen to them if they continue the work. Now, if you're getting money from the government, that's a completely different animal. But most people that I'm talking to are just like, you know what? Let the chips fall where they may. We've made this commitment. We can't walk back from it. The walking back is more dangerous than staying committed, because the long-term damage to your brand in some communities is going to be irreversible, right? We see what's happening with Target. We see what's happening with other major retailers who have decided that they were going to walk back on their commitments. So I think that for me, anyway, what I'm looking at and what I'm hearing, it's more about what I'm hearing than more what I'm looking at, is that people are like, you know what? We're just going to continue on. We've been frozen long enough.
Thank you.
I have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about the DEI maturity scale?
Sure. So the DEI maturity scale is usually an outcome of an assessment. There are as many DE&I maturity scales as there are consultants in consulting firms, all of which have one goal in mind, and that is to let you know where you are on on a scale of say 1 to 5, 1 being nascent, 5 being sophisticated. There are different ways to get at that information, but at the end of the day, after you've done an assessment on your work and your commitment, which is really just collecting information from people in focus groups individually and potentially a survey to validate that information statistically. What the DEI maturity scale does is to tell you where you are, but more importantly, it's meant to tell you the things that you need to do to move to the next level on your DE&I journey. So again, one could sit with a scale, a maturity scale, and one could look at it and take a stab at sort of plotting where you are. Accuracy probably in the 30 to 40% range, based on what you know about your organization. Much more accurate picture comes out of a formal assessment. What you do with that is you socialize it internally and say, this is where we are, this is where the opportunities lie, these are the activities that we need to do to get to the next level. So that's all a maturity. It's like a report card, basically. That's what a maturity scale is. It's like a report card.
Thank you.
Of course.
Can you talk about the business of healthcare and the road ahead for DEI initiatives after policy shifts?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about health equity or whether or not you're talking about sort of the operational piece of it. I think the operational piece of it is a little bit more a threat than the health equity piece is. From what I've seen in the healthcare clients that we've been working with, there seems to be very little threat to the health equity work, social determinants of health, addressing disease states, et cetera. But there seems to be more of a threat in terms of like the operational piece of what I'm going to call sort of the non-clinical side, in terms of some of the work that organizations are committing to, like employee resource groups, like diversity councils, et cetera. Right now, one of the things that I'm seeing in the healthcare space is that, and are there any lawyers on the call? Because it seems to me that the biggest impediment on the healthcare side in terms of like the non-clinical piece is what the law firms are saying put you at risk, right? And actually, that piece around the law firms is pretty prevalent across all industries, around because lawyers are conservative by nature, and that's what it is. So to answer your question directly, I'm not seeing a lot of threat on the health equity side, on the clinical side.
So like having a target of reaching more Black families in hospice, is that a goal that would be a red flag?
No, but I will say that care for transgender youth is definitely um on the target list. And that's problematic, but most of the other things, reducing diabetes and those sorts of things with Asian populations and so on and so forth don't seem to be targets right now.
Thank you.
Anybody else has any? Oh. Yes.
Yeah, I'll ask. Thank you for this. I am curious how to integrate conversations about resistance and non-cooperation as authoritarian regime practices become more prominent in this country, and how we integrate that into yeah, I know it depends on what industries we're in, and some, as you say, some industries are more conservative than others, but I'd love if you have any insights or thoughts about bridging the world of belonging, equity, inclusion, diversity, justice to anti-authoritarianism.
Oh, that's a big one. And I don't know that I could give you an answer based on experience.
Yeah. Okay.
And because for me, and that's, just Madeline and Greg talking, that feels like opening a can of worms around politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that there's a lot of tolerance inside of organizations for what could come of that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how you manage that discussion in a way that is productive, right? And what is it that you want people to do? What is it that you want the organization to do? There are probably people that are a lot more versed in that than I am. So, for instance, if you came to me and said, I wanted you to uh, moderate a discussion about that, and let's just say that the moderator is not part of the discussion or has no opinion about what's going on, I probably wouldn't do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I just kind of feel like and especially now with what's happened within the last week, um, I don't know how productive that would be. I'm not discouraging you.
Yep.
I'm
Yeah.
just saying from my perspective, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one, and I wouldn't know how to
Yeah.
moderate that productively or talk about that productively.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I'll put a resource in the chat that I think at least that's part of my growing edge right
Yeah.
now in terms of I'm an external consultant, coach, all the things, facilitator, and tend to have smaller organizations, but the whole conversation of, how much DEI work do we have now, and how is the languaging? And as I appreciate the slide that was like, okay, here's some organizations and how they're reframing the work in different language. I did a lot of work at MGB, and so that's been a whole.
So
Yeah.
what's happening to our industry and how it impacts the people that are on this call who are the purchasers or the
Mhm.
reliers that rely on us.
Yeah.
What's happening to our industry is a complete collapse,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And there are several arguments in terms of how we got to this point.
Yeah.
But here's what I'll say about that. The rebuilding of our industry is not dependent on the administration backing off their position,
Right.
right? Because in some ways it matters what they do, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what they do because they're going to do what they're going to do.
Right.
The rebuilding of our industry and therefore being able to be of service to the other folks on this call who rely on us for insight is really about how we rebuild our industry to withstand the next storm,
Yeah.
right? Because we weren't prepared for this storm because we always were under the impression that the government would have laws and policies in place that would be supportive of the work. And then all of a sudden, phew,
Right.
right? So this, no one wanted to tackle BLM, right? Like no one wanted to have internal conversations about BLM until employees went to leadership and
Yeah.
said, we want to have conversations about BLM. You and I could be on the outside throwing rocks and bricks, and you should be talking about me. It's not going to work. But once the employees said that they wanted to have it, so to your question, maybe one of the things that needs to happen, and employees need to bring the topic up. They need to say, we want to have conversations about this.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this. I'll put the resource that I know of in the chat.
Sure.
Yeah.
We're almost close to the end. Does anybody else has any questions? Going once, twice. Okay, Greg, thank you so much for presenting to us. Like he said, his email's in the chat. I'll also include it in the polls email to request the slides and to also be on his email list. And I'll send the recording by the end of the day. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye now.